Hi, folks, and welcome to Week 5 on Testimonies and Integrated History in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Before we turn to the methodological challenges of testimonies, let's start with some basic principles of memory by drawing from the rich research program in memory studies. So, how does memory work? It starts with the transformation of perceptual stimuli into a neurological memory code. This part of the process is selective. Not everything that you experience perceptually gets selected for encoding, because the amount of attention you have is limited. This part is also elaborative, meaning that we encode into memory not what is actually happening, but what we interpret or perceive to be happening. The next stage is storage, which itself is broken down into substages, starting with immediate brief sensory registers, lasting only a few seconds, to short-term memory to long-term memory. Now, in a moment, I'll talk about how trauma interferes with this normal, linear sense of time. The final stage is retrieval, although this is a bit more complicated, because memory is not a thing per se. It's not like recording a video and storing it in an archive for future retrieval, like plucking a cassette tape off the shelf or something. Instead, memory recall involves reconstructing the past with the help of inferential reasoning. Right, so you remember some key details of an event, and your brain basically fills in the rest. So a key principle of memory is that it is constructed. We selectively remember the past in order to meet some present or future needs. This means that our memories are fundamentally subjective, of course. We all know that memory is fallible, subject to error, and not in any way objective vessels of historical meaning. It's pretty much common sense, right? Our memories are unreliable, subjective, misleading, and not very reliable in terms of empirically representing the past. Indeed, there are any number of legal cases involving lying witnesses and wrongful convictions based on false or inaccurate witness testimony. Lawyers have a number of different ways of detecting eyewitness error. So, was the witness in a position to accurately observe the events in question? Did they see it firsthand? In a courtroom, they'd ask a witness, how close or far were they from the incident? Was the light good? Were they wearing their glasses or whatever? We'd never be so uncouth as to ask whether or not a survivor was wearing their glasses, so that's not what I'm saying. I'm just referring to a common line of questioning in the courtroom to make a point about the fallibility of memory. Another source of eyewitness error is the witness's state of mind. This is especially pertinent for genocide testimonies because trauma affects how people remember the past, as we'll see. Plus, people just misremember things. Like I said before, human memory does not work like a videotape recorder or a movie camera. Right? So when we want to remember something, we don't go and pluck a memory out of the memory store. As we saw on the previous slide, memory is constructed from stored and available bits of information. Any gaps in the information are filled in unconsciously by inferences, which are naturally another source of error. It happens all the time, in fact. And finally, and most simply, the eyewitness may just be lying, although there's never a simple binary between truth and lies. I'll come back to this point later when I address how to deal with perpetrator and bystander testimonies. The issue of veracity in testimonies is all the more complicated when it comes to traumatic memories. By definition, trauma is historical in nature and stored in memory. Whether it's physiological, psychological, spiritual, cultural, whatever type of trauma it is, it involves a lasting injury or harm. Trauma is thus defined simply as present suffering related to past violence. It's the intrusion of the past into the present. As a structure of experience, it's marked by an inherent latency and belatedness. A traumatic event is not simply experienced as it occurs, but only becomes fully evident later on, after the fact. In terms of our discussion this week, we're especially concerned with the cognitive effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. On the one hand, people with PTSD have deficient working, i.e., short-term memory. On the other hand, survivors may experience flashback memories, which involve a reliving of traumatic experiences, a sense of being in the past rather than recalling the past. Importantly, there's evidence that flashbacks are not necessarily veridical accounts of traumatic experiences. That is to say, they're not necessarily objective or empirically accurate reconstructions of what actually happened. Studies have demonstrated that the content of flashback memories can change over time and are influenced by current concerns. This point is reflected in the widely noted distinction in the literature on Holocaust testimonies between common memory and deep memory. Common memory refers to the normal, historically grounded, and chronologically charted memory that we're all familiar with. In terms of Holocaust and genocide testimonies, this occurs when an oral narrator recalls their experiences from the perspective of their pre- or post-genocide self. Common memory is fairly straightforward. First this happened, then this, then that, so on and so forth. As we'll see, organizations that record testimonies often favor this type of easily accessible memory that seemingly enables a sense of closure. Yet the desire for rationally ordered survivor testimonies is often interrupted by traumatic memories, which are often repressed, kept buried down as an unresolved trauma that lies beyond the reach of meaning. Deep memory thus refers to those memories that record the physical imprint of a traumatic event within the individual. They are lodged deeply within a survivor's body, prone to involuntary eruptions. This tension between deep and common memory can pose a critical methodological conundrum for researchers. For example, take the case of Serena, whose last name is withheld, a Holocaust survivor who was interviewed for the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale. Her story was famously recounted by Dori Laub, an Israeli psychiatrist and psychoanalyst at Yale who was not only a Holocaust survivor himself, but led the way in video recording survivor testimonies. Anyways, Laub tells the story of an academic conference in the mid-1980s where they showed Serena's recorded testimony. In it, Serena recalls seeing 4 crematoria chimneys going up in flames during the 1944 Sonderkommando uprising in Birkenau. Now, objectively speaking, this was inaccurate. Only 1 chimney was blown up, not 4. This, Laub reports, ignited a debate, as the historians at the conference felt that this inaccuracy could jeopardize the struggle against deniers. In turn, the psychoanalyst at the conference, who was later confirmed to be Laub himself, objected that Serena was simply speaking to a deeper level of extreme experience related to historical trauma. So this debate really hinged on 2 different conceptions of truth. On the one hand, historical truth searches for factual accuracy that can be corroborated and cannot be dismissed or denied. It is time-bound and is dedicated to the strict observance of what we introduced in week 4 as correspondence theory, where the aim is to come as close as possible to what, quote, really happened. On the other hand, psychoanalysis, which, by the way, began as a theory of trauma, is geared towards what it calls narrative truth, which involves a subject trying to make coherent sense of a traumatic past in order to achieve some degree of closure. These traumatic memories may not be empirically accurate, in the sense of corresponding with what, quote-unquote, really happened, but they nevertheless represent actual lived experiences. Just because they may be empirically inaccurate makes them no less true. This divergence is reflected in the etymology of the keyword truth, the dominant meaning of which is in accordance with fact or reality, reflecting the world or state of things as they actually exist. Yet this connotation is etymologically more recent, dating back to the early modern era. At a deeper etymological level, however, the original meaning of truth was being characterized in good faith, as in being authentic, true to oneself, genuinely felt. In that sense, Serena's testimony demonstrated a narrative truth, not a historical truth. It was empirically inaccurate, but nevertheless reflected a lived experience. Again, these divergent notions of truth pose critical methodological issues for dealing with testimonies, as our readings this week by Zoe Waxman and Christopher Browning both frame a common dilemma with using survivor testimonies. On the one hand, sticking with the broader sense of narrative truth as defined by authenticity, there are some scholars who view survivor testimonies in almost quasi-spiritual or sacred terms and believe that they should be afforded the utmost respect and reverence. Other scholars don't necessarily go this far, but still nevertheless afford survivor testimonies a certain degree of deference, as with Jan Gross, who we'll read next week, for example, and who argues that we should, by default, accept the veracity of survivor testimonies until we find persuasive arguments to the contrary. On the other hand, pointing toward the narrow sense of historical truth as defined by veracity, there are some scholars who view survivor testimonies in more instrumental terms, insofar as they provide micro-level data that can be quote-unquote mined by researchers for various illustrative means. Arguably, Saul Friedlander's approach could fit within this category. We'll talk about that in a moment. Some Holocaust scholars, including very eminent ones like Raoul Hilberg and Lucy Davidovitz, avoided using survivor testimonies altogether due to the extent to which they were sometimes riddled with empirical errors, as we saw with the case of Serena and the 4 chimneys during the Auschwitz uprising. Of course, it is possible to find a middle ground. On the one hand, we can use the subjective authenticity of testimonies to supply meaning, not strictly in terms of facts per se, but in terms of exploring the depths of human experiences during genocide. On the other hand, in terms of obtaining objective veracity of the past, We can also use survivor testimonies not only to provide illustrative empirical details, but, as we'll see with Friedlander's integrative approach, to also insert a human element into what may otherwise be a cold, hard reconstruction of the past. Okay, so before I get back to the methodological issues with witness testimonies, I do want to call attention to the major repositories of Holocaust and genocide testimonies. The Fortunoff Archive at Yale was a pioneer in collecting video testimonies of Holocaust survivors. With approximately 4,400 video testimonies, the archive is very protective of its holdings, maintaining a single, on-site access point at Yale University's library, while ensuring that only the most dedicated and rigorous students, educators, and scholars will travel to Yale in order to access their collections. This restriction has limited the broader circulation of its holdings. Now, in terms of its interview methodology, the archive emphasizes witness agency to tell their own stories. So unlike some other repositories, it doesn't necessarily favor neat, chronological narratives with cathartic or redemptive aspects. From its inception, the Fortunoff Archive emphasized the human dimension of suffering at the heart of the Holocaust, rather than its broader historical picture. This is in contrast to our next example, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which also houses a sizable collection of testimonies, which in turn reflect the museum's institutional preferences, as they are used to enable visitors to quote-unquote meet Holocaust survivors through audiovisual media. In terms of interview methodology, this tended towards a concern for interviews' exhibition rather than archival value, as the curative process was used to mine recordings for the much coveted nuggets. Only segments of selected few are included in the exhibits, but all the interviews remain unedited within the archive. Finally, the USC Shoah Foundation has the largest collection of testimonies, which it is working to digitize and make accessible to students, researchers, and the general public. It also includes survivors not just from the Holocaust, but from other genocides as well, including Armenia, Cambodia, Rwanda, and Guatemala. I encourage you all to register for free with its Visual History Archive and to explore their holdings. Now, in terms of interview methodology, the Shoah Foundation has developed practices that shape testimonial accounts into coherent and accessible narrative segments that implicitly use a dramaturgical or cinematic storytelling structure. The key point from all of this is that survivor testimonies, like all other historical documentation, are mediated to varying degrees and in varying ways. At the very least, we have to be aware of this mediation as we use these types of sources. This gets even trickier when we deal with testimonies from former perpetrators and bystanders, people who have reasons for being less forthcoming. Thankfully, we have some guidance here. For example, we have a reading by Christopher Browning, who offers some methodological reflections on how to deal with the multiple testimonies by Adolf Eichmann. Browning says that anyone who wants to dismiss Eichmann's testimonies on the grounds of their demonstrated unreliability and shameless self-serving lies can easily do so. But what if our default position is not to dismiss everything Eichmann said and wrote just because he was lying most of the time, but rather to ask what among his massive lies might nonetheless be of help to the historian, given Eichmann's unique vantage point and sheer volume of testimony? How should one go about trying to sift nuggets of useful information from the mass of mendacious slug? Browning proposes a number of tactics that I think could be applied to any perpetrator testimony. First, the self-interest test. When Eichmann made statements against self-interest, or when he was in a situation where telling the truth was in his self-interest, a closer look is merited. Secondly, the vividness test. When Eichmann described events with unusual attention to details, visual memory, the actual occurrence of those events should be seriously considered, even if Eichmann's framing of those events, in other words, the meaning of his participation in them, should still be viewed very skeptically. Third, the possibility test. When Eichmann's claims are not contradicted or proven impossible, even in light of the more extensive documentation now available, they should not be summarily rejected. And fourth, the probability test. When Eichmann's accounts coincide with or fit a pattern of events suggested or established by other documentation, they can not only be viewed as possible, but also as probable. The ethnographer and political scientist Leanne Fuji takes a somewhat different approach when dealing with the often less than forthcoming testimonies, not just of perpetrators, but also bystanders and other implicated subjects. So while conducting her fieldwork in Rwanda, a decade after the genocide there, she encountered a number of rhetorical obstacles while interviewing her research subjects. As frustrating or as difficult as they might have been, she did not approach these as roadblocks to the truth. On the contrary, she encourages us to rethink lying, denial, misinformation, and other forms of untruths as data that needs to be collected and analyzed. This data, she contends, can reveal people's interior thoughts and feelings, as well as indicate how the current social and political landscape is shaping what people might say to a researcher. Now, in order to put all this together, we can use the concept of triangulation. This concept is borrowed from navigational and land surveying techniques, where it is used to locate a point from two others of known distance apart, given the angles of a triangle formed by the 3 points. As it applies to qualitative research, triangulation basically means approaching the research problem, issue, or question from multiple perspectives. Now, this could be done using more than one methodology, such as using microhistories and comparative analysis, for example, or content and discourse analysis, which we'll talk about in subsequent weeks. But triangulation also applies to the use of historical sources, in the sense of using more than one type of data source to examine an issue. This could mean using testimonies alongside archival documents, or even secondary sources. Now, although this concept itself is not widely used in Holocaust and genocide studies, the practice of data triangulation is actually quite common, especially when it comes to the use of testimonies. Given some of the limitations and challenges with using testimonies, the practice of triangulation enables us to use this crucial reservoir of data by analyzing it alongside other sources. In an empirical sense, this method works best by searching for corroborating evidence that can be used to substantiate testimonies, although corroboration isn't necessarily the key determinant or qualification for using triangulation. This method can also be used in a more stylistic or aesthetic sense, as demonstrated by the magnum opera, i.e. the plural form of magnum opus, of the great historian Saul Friedlander. We'll get back to these masterpieces in a moment, but first some context. Holocaust historiography had reached something of a stalemate in the 1980s when, as I noted last week, the literature was marked by a strong sense of positivism and empiricism, very much in the vein of the traditional von Rankian approach to historiography. Scholars had taken their cues from the Nuremberg trials, where victim testimony was expressly excluded from the proceedings in favor of official documentation. In that sense, the literature was very much interpreted through the eyes of the perpetrators. It may be hard to believe now, and it's certainly easy to forget, that victim-based testimonies remained outside the broader academic canon and community. Many prominent scholars believe that victim-based historiography was too invested and wrapped up in traumatic memories to provide the necessary distance and detachment presumably required to undertake a proper, scholarly scientific investigation of genocidal past. This is what was at stake, for example, during the famous historians debate in West Germany in the late 1980s, particularly with the highly regarded exchange between Friedlander and German historian Martin Broszat. It was in this context that Friedlander devised an integrated approach for his monumental 2-volume study of the Holocaust. As he explains in one of this week's supplementary readings, there are 3 characteristics to his concept of an integrated history. The first is the idea of expanding the scope of Holocaust history far beyond Germany, whereas the scope of action in the first volume, which covers 1933 to 39, naturally covers events in Germany. In the second volume, Friedlander masterfully weaves together the story of annihilation of Jews across wartime Europe. The second pivotal dimension of this integrated history is his endeavor to include the voices of the victims. Friedlander justifies his approach thusly, quote, "The history of the Holocaust cannot be limited only to a recounting of German policies, decisions, and measures that led to the most systematic and sustained of genocides. It must include the reactions, and at times the initiatives, of the surrounding world and the attitudes of the victims, for the fundamental reason that the events we call the Holocaust represents a totality defined by this very convergence of distinct elements." We'll talk about this some more momentarily. A third aspect of an integrated history of the Holocaust mixes the first 2 elements into a simultaneous representation. Only the succession of phases, each presenting the synchronicity of events both throughout occupied Europe and within each country, can indicate the interrelatedness of this history. Friedlander's exemplary 2-volume history of the Holocaust has spawned its own wide-ranging body of secondary literature, such as our reading this week by Alan Confino, which analyzes Friedlander's narrative style. Especially considering how his integrative approach works toward a peculiar historical sensibility, one speaks to a sense of narrative truth that works on top of, or in conjunction with, the more traditional sense of historical truth. As used by Friedlander, victim testimony serves a disruptive function in the narrative. The core structure of his history of the Holocaust follows a conventional emplotment that is periodically punctuated by a series of brief vignettes. The use of these vignettes, or quick cuts, resembles that of a filmmaker or novelist, as the reader is alerted to the narrative of dislocation, characterized by moving from one scene to another by the ubiquitous double space that separates the scenes. Now, this isn't just a stylistic convention, as Friedlander uses these testimonies to articulate the sense of disbelief and uncertainty that was distinctive of the Jewish experience during the Holocaust. In the intro to Friedlander's first volume, he writes that in many works in Holocaust history, the implicit assumptions regarding the victims' generalized hopelessness and passivity have turned them into a static and abstract element of the historical background. Instead, he shows how their voices are essential for understanding the utter blindness of human beings confronted with an entirely new and utterly horrifying reality, thereby putting the Nazis' actions into full perspective. Victim testimonies therefore utilize far more than simply as an illustrative device, used to bolster more traditional, objective-oriented Reconstructionist histories, much like in the vein of Chris Browning's work on the slave labor camp. More significantly, this type of integrative methodology speaks more to the intersubjective realities as they were experienced by the actual actors and subjects of history. And this type of approach can be applied to other historical contexts and to other analytical ends. For example, American historian Jeffrey Osler deploys a similar type of integrative approach in his various works on Native American genocides. Okay, and that's it. Let me quickly explain the workload this week, as once again there are two parallel things going on. Firstly, and this is entirely unrelated to the preceding video lecture, you're starting the project planning exercise this week on the discussion forum. So the whole idea of this exercise is to workshop ideas and to draft language for your research proposal assignment that's due at the end of the semester. So this week, start by identifying your topic. It's entirely up to you what you want to focus on, so long as it's broadly within the realm of Holocaust and genocide studies. Once you've selected a topic, come up with a working title. Maybe you have more than one, that's fine. After your title, write a 300 to 500 word intro paragraph. Think of it like writing an abstract, or the beginning of a drafting process that may culminate in an abstract. That's the goal in this week's exercise. Secondly, we have another supplementary discussion forum this week. Like before, it's not mandatory, and it usually doesn't get a lot of traction, but I just want to make it available. Oh, and let me further explain the reading loads for weeks 5 through 8, as I've grouped the readings into two categories. So we have some more methodological readings that are more reflective in terms of methodology, and then we have some illustrative readings that are supposed to be examples of such methodologies in action. Again, this is all stuff you don't have to read now, you can just save it for later, but for those of you so inclined to read more and share some relevant thoughts, the supplementary discussion forum is a place for you to do so. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.